For 12 hours, Kharg Island went completely dark. Not metaphorically, literally. The island that handles the overwhelming majority of Iran's entire seaborne oil exports, the single most economically critical piece of infrastructure Iran possesses outside of its underground military sites, stopped transmitting the routine operational and navigational lighting signals that commercial shipping and satellite trackers rely on to monitor activity there around the clock. Tanker traffic, that normally queues to load at Kharg's terminals, simply stopped moving. Ship trackers watching the island's usual pattern of arrivals and departures saw nothing. And then, 12 hours later, activity resumed as if nothing had happened, except that when commercial satellite imagery of the island became available in the following days, it showed something that does not match Iran's official explanation for the blackout at all. I'm going to walk you through what actually appears to have happened on Kharg Island during those 12 dark hours, what the satellite imagery shows that contradicts Iran's public account, and why an oil terminal going completely silent for half a day, without a single explosion, missile, or public acknowledgement of an attack, might end up mattering more to the trajectory of this conflict than several of the more dramatic strikes we've covered on this channel. Stay with me, because the detail buried in that satellite imagery is not what most of the early coverage of this story got right. Before I walk you through what happened, I want to be upfront about how I'm approaching this one, because a story built around a communications blackout and satellite imagery interpretation is exactly the kind of story that invites confident-sounding speculation, and separating verified analysis from guesswork is the entire point of this breakdown. My background is in energy infrastructure and strategic economic targets, specifically how a small number of critical nodes like Kharg Island function as choke points for an entire economy, and how damage or disruption to them gets measured and confirmed. That's the lens I'm using here. Where something is confirmed by satellite imagery analysts or shipping data, I'll say so plainly. Where it's genuinely still uncertain, I'll tell you that too. Let's get into it. To understand why a 12-hour blackout at Kharg Island is such a significant event, you need to understand just how much of Iran's entire economy runs through that single, relatively small piece of land. Kharg Island sits roughly 16 miles off Iran's southern coast in the Persian Gulf and has functioned as Iran's primary oil export terminal for decades, handling the substantial majority of the country's crude exports through a network of loading berths, storage tanks, and pipeline connections back to Iran's mainland oil fields. Unlike a military base or an underground facility, Kharg Island's importance is almost entirely economic rather than tactical in the traditional sense, which is exactly why it has historically been treated as an unusually sensitive target throughout Iran's various conflicts. Damaging or disrupting Iran's ability to export oil does not just affect its military capability. It strikes directly at the revenue that funds the regime itself, along with the broader economy that ordinary Iranians depend on, which is part of why any incident at Kharg tends to draw international attention far beyond the immediate scale of whatever actually happened there. Kharg Island has a long, difficult history precisely because of that outsized economic importance. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the island was repeatedly targeted by Iraqi airstrikes, specifically because of its role in funding Iran's war effort, sustaining significant damage to its loading facilities over the course of that conflict, despite Iran's efforts to defend and repeatedly repair it. That history has shaped how seriously Iran treats any threat to the island today, with substantial air defense assets concentrated around it and a degree of operational secrecy around its activities that exceeds what is typical even for other sensitive Iranian infrastructure. Which is exactly why a 12-hour blackout there, whatever caused it, was always going to be read as a potentially serious event rather than a routine technical hiccup, given how much both Iran's government and international oil markets depend on that island functioning normally and predictably. That defensive buildup around Kharg is also precisely why an external strike there has always carried far greater risk of triggering serious escalation than strikes against more purely military targets elsewhere in the country. Unlike a remote underground facility or a forward military installation, Kharg Island sits close enough to major shipping lanes and international commercial interest that any acknowledged military strike against it would almost certainly draw immediate, sustained international attention given the direct link between the island's operational status and global oil prices. That combination, extremely high strategic value paired with extremely high political cost for any adversary openly attacking it, has effectively made Kharg one of the few sites in Iran that has remained untouched by direct acknowledged strikes throughout this entire conflict, even as far more heavily defended military and nuclear-adjacent sites elsewhere in the country have been hit repeatedly. That pattern is exactly what makes this incident, whatever its true cause, such a notable break from how this conflict has unfolded up to this point. Here's what we actually know about the blackout itself. Commercial shipping trackers who monitor tanker activity around Kharg Island, as a matter of course, first noticed the disruption, when the island's usual transponder and navigational signal activity simply stopped alongside a halt in the routine arrival and departure pattern of tankers. that normally queue to load crude there on a near continuous basis. That pattern held for approximately 12 hours before normal-looking activity resumed. Iran's official explanation, issued through state media in the immediate aftermath, attributed the disruption to a technical fault in the island's power and communications infrastructure, describing it as a maintenance issue unrelated to any external cause, and emphasizing that oil loading operations had not been meaningfully affected. That is the explanation the satellite imagery does not fully support. Commercial satellite passes over Kharg Island in the days following the blackout showed visible activity around a section of the island's storage tank farm that analysts described as inconsistent with a routine power outage. Specifically, imagery showed what appeared to be scorching and structural change to at least one storage tank, along with vehicle and equipment activity around that same area consistent with emergency response and repair work, rather than the kind of activity you would expect from a simple electrical fault affecting communications equipment. A power and communications failure, however serious, does not typically leave visible thermal damage on a storage tank. Something happened to at least one physical structure on that island during the window Iran describes purely as a technical outage, and whatever it was, it appears serious enough to require follow-up repair activity that satellite trackers were able to observe directly. This is the detail from the imagery that most of the early coverage of this story is getting wrong. Several initial reports treated the visible tank damage as evidence of a missile or drone strike, consistent with the pattern of attacks we've covered elsewhere in this conflict. But analysts who specialize in reading this kind of imagery have pointed out that the damage pattern visible at Kharg does not clearly match the signature typically left by an external strike. No visible crater, no debris field, consistent with an incoming munition, no secondary damage to surrounding structures that a missile or drone impact would typically produce. What the imagery is more consistent with, according to several analysts, is an internal fire or explosion originating from within the storage or pumping infrastructure itself, the kind of incident that could result from equipment failure, a maintenance accident, or, in a reading, some analysts consider plausible given the broader conflict, deliberate sabotage carried out by a small team rather than an external strike. That distinction matters enormously for understanding what actually happened, because an internally caused incident implies either a serious safety and maintenance failure inside one of Iran's most carefully guarded facilities, or a covert operation that managed to penetrate security around one of the most heavily defended sites in the entire country. And right now, credible analysts are genuinely divided on which explanation the available evidence best supports. If this was an internal accident, it raises real questions about the condition of critical infrastructure inside Iran after months of sustained conflict sanctions-driven maintenance shortfalls and the broader strain the country's economy has been under throughout this war. Aging infrastructure operating under wartime pressure, without easy access to replacement parts or foreign technical expertise due to years of sanctions, is inherently more prone to exactly this kind of failure. And a serious incident at Kharg specifically would be a visible, symbolically significant example of that broader strain finally showing up at the country's most economically vital site. If instead, this was the result of deliberate sabotage, whether carried out by external intelligence services, internal dissident networks, or some combination the specifics of which remain entirely unconfirmed, it would represent a strike against Iran's economic lifeline that did not require a single missile, aircraft, or acknowledged military operation. An approach that avoids the kind of direct escalation a conventional airstrike against Kharg would almost certainly trigger, while still inflicting real damage on the target that matters most to Iran's ability to sustain this conflict financially. Iran's continued insistence on the technical fault explanation, even after satellite imagery began circulating publicly showing damage inconsistent with that account, follows a pattern we've discussed before in how the regime manages information around sensitive incidents. Acknowledging sabotage at Kharg specifically would be an enormous admission, both because of the island's symbolic importance to the regime's economic survival, and because it would confirm a level of vulnerability at one of the most heavily defended sites in the country that Iran has every reason to want to downplay, regardless of whether the underlying cause was external sabotage or an embarrassing internal failure. That incentive to minimize applies almost equally under either explanation, which is part of why official Iranian statements are unlikely to provide much additional clarity here, even as more imagery and shipping data becomes available in the coming days. Let's talk about what this means for the broader trajectory of the conflict. Because an incident at Kharg Island carries implications that extend well beyond the physical damage to a single storage tank. Oil markets and shipping insurers, who have already been pricing elevated risk into Gulf region tanker traffic throughout this conflict, treat any confirmed disruption at Kharg specifically as a uniquely significant signal, given the island's outsized role in Iran's total export capacity. Even a temporary partial disruption at a single storage facility can be enough to move oil futures and insurance premiums measurably, not because of the physical scale of the damage itself, but because of what it represents about the vulnerability of a site widely assumed to be among the most secure and closely guarded in the entire country. But because of what it represents about the vulnerability of a site widely assumed to be among the most secure and closely guarded in the entire country. If this incident does turn out to be the result of a covert operation that successfully breached Kharg's defenses, that alone reshapes how vulnerable Iran's economic infrastructure is understood to be for the remainder of this conflict, regardless of how much actual physical damage was ultimately done. It's worth being specific about the mechanics here, because it explains why analysts are watching Kharg-related news this closely, even in the absence of a confirmed cause. Because it explains why analysts are watching Kharg-related news this closely, even in the absence of a confirmed cause. It's worth being specific about the mechanics here, because it explains why analysts are watching Kharg-related news this closely, even in the absence of a confirmed cause. Oil trading is, in large part, a market built on anticipated risk, rather than only realized damage, meaning that a credible possibility of ongoing vulnerability at a site like Kharg can move prices nearly as much as a confirmed ongoing disruption would. Traders and underwriters do not need certainty about what happened during those 12 hours to adjust their models. They only need enough uncertainty about Kharg's security and reliability going forward to price in a higher probability of future disruption. And that repricing can happen within hours of imagery like this, circulating well before any government or independent investigator reaches a definitive conclusion about the underlying cause. There's also a longer-term strategic question worth sitting with here. If sabotage against Kharg proves to be a viable, low-cost way to inflict real economic damage on Iran, without triggering the kind of escalation a conventional strike would produce that opens up an entirely different category of pressure that could be applied repeatedly throughout the remainder of this conflict, one that does not require risking aircraft, publicly authorizing a strike, or accepting the diplomatic fallout of an acknowledged attack on economic infrastructure. If sabotage against Kharg proves to be a viable, low-cost way to inflict real economic damage on Iran without triggering the kind of escalation a conventional strike would produce, that opens up an entirely different category of pressure that could be applied repeatedly throughout the remainder of this conflict, one that does not require risking aircraft, publicly authorizing a strike, or accepting the diplomatic fallout of an acknowledged attack on economic infrastructure. That kind of pressure is harder for Iran to defend against precisely because it does not look like a conventional military threat, and harder for outside observers to track and confirm precisely because neither side has an incentive to be fully transparent about what actually happened. This kind of ambiguous, deniable pressure campaign, if that is in fact what this incident represents, would also mark a meaningful evolution in how this conflict is being fought compared to its earlier, more visibly kinetic phases. Strikes involving stealth bombers, missiles, and acknowledged military operations are dramatic and easily documented, but they also carry clear attribution and predictable diplomatic consequences for whichever side authorizes them. An unexplained fire at a heavily guarded economic facility, by contrast, allows whoever may be responsible to inflict real, lasting damage on Iran's financial capacity while leaving enough uncertainty that no formal escalation, retaliation, or diplomatic reckoning is clearly required. If this pattern holds and repeats at other sensitive Iranian sites in the coming weeks, it would suggest the conflict is entering a phase defined less by visible strikes and more by exactly this kind of quiet, deniable economic pressure. A shift that would be considerably harder for outside observers and for Iran itself to track and respond to in real time. Let me bring this down to what actually matters here beyond the strategic analysis. Kharg Island is not just a piece of infrastructure on a map. It is the mechanism through which Iran converts its oil reserves into the revenue that funds everything else the regime is doing throughout this conflict, from military spending to the broader economic pressures ordinary Iranians are already living under. An incident there, however it was actually caused, is a direct hit on that mechanism, and the fact that Iran felt compelled to offer any explanation at all, rather than simply declining to comment. It tells you the regime understood immediately how significant this looked to outside observers, even before the satellite imagery came out that appears to contradict their own account. Before you go, I want to ask you two things directly. First, if this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what actually happened at Kharg than the early, less careful coverage circulating elsewhere, share it with one person trying to make sense of this conflict. That's genuinely the only way careful analysis like this reaches people instead of getting buried under louder content. Second, I want your read in the comments. Do you think this was a covert sabotage operation against one of Iran's most heavily defended economic sites? Or an embarrassing internal failure that Iran is trying to cover with a more convenient explanation? Drop your assessment below. I rate every one of them, and if this video delivered real value, a like helps it reach people who need a clear-headed breakdown instead of speculation. Here's where this stands. Kharg Island, the terminal handling the overwhelming majority of Iran's seaborne oil exports, went completely dark for approximately 12 hours, with tanker traffic and routine signal activity stopping entirely before resuming as if nothing had happened. Iran's official explanation attributes the blackout to a routine technical fault, but commercial satellite imagery taken in the days afterward shows visible thermal damage to at least one storage tank and follow-up repair activity inconsistent with a simple power outage, while also lacking the clear signature of an external missile or drone strike. Analysts remain genuinely divided over whether this reflects an internal accident tied to wartime strain on aging infrastructure, or a covert sabotage operation that successfully penetrated one of the most heavily defended sites in the country. And Iran's continued insistence on the technical fault explanation is unlikely to resolve that uncertainty given the regime's strong incentive to minimize either possibility. Whatever the true cause, an incident of this kind at Iran's single most economically vital piece of infrastructure is being read by oil markets, shipping insurers, and regional analysts alike as a genuinely significant moment in this conflict, one that may reveal a form of low-cost, low-visibility pressure that could shape how the remainder of this war is actually fought. Stay locked in on this one, because the true story behind those 12 dark hours is very much still unfolding.